Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to learn how to create a basic inventory for Ansible. So remember that we are at the same level of our Docker Compose file in this lesson. If we type docker ps, we're going to see our Jenkins container up and running, our remote host, and our DV container. We have these containers up and running. So cool. The first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to head to the Jenkins Ansible directory that we created before, and I will leave all the files that we're going to use in this directory for you to have them and for you to use them. So cool. The first thing that I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna copy the key, so you can have the key in this directory. So that key is on the CentOS 7 directory, remote key. Pretty cool. So at this moment we have the Docker file and the remote key in this directory. So let's go ahead and create a new file at the same level of the Docker file and the remote key file under the Jenkins Ansible directory, which is going to be a hosts file. So let's hit enter and let's start editing this file. So inventories in Ansible are a key concept, and the inventory is nothing else but the file where you define all of your hosts. So we're going to be covering this in here. Don't worry if you have never created an inventory before, we're going to do it step by step. So in Ansible, you can start your inventory doing something like all vars, which stands for all the variables. And we want to specify one important variable, which is the Ansible connection. It means how Ansible is going to connect to other hosts, and this is going to be through SSH. If you have doubts or questions, you can always go to Google and look for Ansible Inventory to find out more. So it is like Ansible Inventory, and then you are going to look for anything that you want, and the documentation is actually pretty cool, as you can see here. I will show you the most basic example for you to have a clear understanding of what is an inventory. So cool. In this case, we want the connection to be through SSH. So that's pretty cool. Now, we can start defining groups. So a groups is nothing else but, for example, let's say that you have production servers. So probably your group is going to be production. But let's say that you have development servers. So your group could be dev or development. So a group is a name that defines a bunch of servers that have things in common. So in this case, we're going to say something like a test group. It doesn't matter, you can call it as you want. Now that we have our group created, we need to start telling Ansible who belongs to this group. So in Ansible, we have something like an alias, and we define an alias for our host. So in this case, we're going to call our host test1. So Ansible is going to know that test1 is going to be a host, and we're going to specify the details later. But keep in mind that, for example, our host is going to be the remote host container, so it's going to be the remote host. So please keep in mind that this is the real IP or DNS where your server or your service lives. In this case, this is our remote host container, but this is an alias. So Ansible is going to know that whenever we ask for test1, it's going to look for the remote host. But how Ansible is going to know that? Well, we still need to configure that. So let's go ahead and type Ansible host. So Ansible host is a variable that tells Ansible which host it's going to be using the backend to reach this name. So whenever we ask for test1, Ansible is going to look for the remote host, right? So this is pretty cool. Now we need to define some other commands or instructions for Ansible to fully know how to connect to that server. So remember that when we configure the SSH plugin and we created the key file, the remote host, the remote user, we specified the user and the remote key. So in this case, we need to specify the user as well. So this is going to be the Ansible user. All of these values, you can find them in the documentation. I'm just giving them here to make this simple. So the Ansible user, it's going to be the remote user. So remember that for now, we have the remote host, which is going to be the IP address, and the remote user, which is going to be the user that Ansible is going to use to connect to the remote host. So let me save this to show you. If you take a look to your Docker compose file, remember that the remote host is the name that we define to the service. And if you take a look in your CentOS 7 directory on your Docker file, remember that we created a remote user. So this is what we're defining in here. So pretty nice. Now we need to do one more thing, and that's defining the Ansible private key file. So the variable is called Ansible private key file, and this is going to be the path inside of the container where the key is living. So this is pretty similar to the configuration that we did on the Jenkins dashboard, but now we're doing it in the Ansible way. So which value should we put in here? Well, remember that we're going to run this inside of the Jenkins container. So let's go ahead inside of the Jenkins container and look for the path for the private key that we copied in the previous video. Let's go to home directory. Let's look for the Ansible directory that we created, and here is the remote key. So if you type pwd, you're going to find the full path where this file is living. So if you copy this and then you give a slash and the name of this key and you hit enter, well, ls, and you are going to see that this is the full path for this file. So this is the full path inside of the container. So let's go ahead and copy this. Let's go outside of this container and let's modify our host file again, and let's add this full path to this variable. So we're telling Ansible, hey Ansible, you're going to connect to the remote host using the remote user and using this private key file through SSH. So this is pretty cool. Let's save this again. And now remember that here we're outside of the container. So we need to copy this file that we just created to the container. And remember that we already created a volume, so now we can share files between the host and the container. So let's copy this hosts file to our Jenkins home Ansible directory. Cool. Now if we exec into the Jenkins container, and if we type cd, type in cd or cd home is exactly the same thing. So if we go to Ansible, we do an ls, we're going to find the hosts file that we copied in here, which is pretty cool. If we cut this file, this has the content that we created. Awesome. The only one thing that we need to do is to test the connection from here. Remember that we're inside of the Jenkins container, and if we ping the remote host, then we're going to have an answer. But now, how do we ping that host using Ansible? Well, that's a good question, and we're going to type Ansible-I and then the name of the hosts file that we created. In this case, the name is host. So let's type host, and then we're going to type -m, which in Ansible means a model, and we're going to use the ping model to ask for the test1 host that we're defining here. So let's clean the screen and let's hit enter and see what happens. Here you can see the Ansible return as exists message, which means that our configuration is correct, and now Ansible is capable to connect to the remote host using the definitions that we specified in this host inventory. So as I told you before, Ansible is using the test1 host, but in the background Ansible is using that remote host, that remote user, and this private key file to make the connection to the remote container. So this is pretty cool. You already know how to create an inventory and how to ping one host from Ansible and have a success answer. So this is it for this video. I'll see you in the next lesson.